Active learning means you participate, collaborate with others, and apply concepts to the real world. It requires hard mental effort, but leads to better retention and an understanding of the material that can be transferred to other situations. To understand why active learning works so well, it helps to know that when our brain decides what to remember, it asks itself two fundamental questions. Can I understand? And do I need to know? When you ask, "Can I understand?" your brain always puts the new information on the foundation of existing knowledge. If the foundation is missing, the brain has no idea what to do with it, and as a result, it throws it away. In other words, your brain needs to build foundational neuron connections for new information to attach to, which is both why active learning is more mental work, but also essential for learning. When we ask ourselves, "Do I need to know?" our brain separates between the material it finds worth to remember and the one it can forget. If it's unlikely that new information will ever be used again, the brain is smart enough to throw it away. If your brain finds that the information is needed again, say it could increase your social status, the brain will store it in long-term memory. To stay there and be easily recalled, you just have to periodically use or think of it. To understand how a large body of research has shown big differences in the outcomes between passive and active learning. In one carefully executed experiment, physics instructors taught their course in two ways. Some classes were taught in a conventional style, and others using active learning. Even though the teachers were the same and the students were similar, on average the active learners doubled their understanding when they were tested at the end of the course. Other experiments have shown that long-term retention is higher as well. Students that take conventional lecture that is followed by a test forget around 90% of the material within 6 months. In an active learning environment, students can retain more than 70% of what they have learned 2 years later. Sometimes, teachers show a problem and then demonstrate to the class how to solve it. They believe that they can just transfer their own thinking into the student's head through an explanation. Unfortunately, for new ideas, a brain doesn't work that way. Unless the brain actively constructs those ideas within, it is as if the material was never heard.
I would bet that you are not studying anywhere nearly as effectively as you could be. And why should you care? Well, if you study more effectively, you can learn more and retain more in less time. That translates to less time studying, better grades, and more time doing the things you actually enjoy. In this video, we'll cover all the study hacks I learned in medical school and what I wish I knew back in college. What's going on, guys? Dr. Jabal, MedSchoolInsiders.com. This video is an updated version of my first ever video, Pre-Med Study Strategies, What I Wish I Knew in College. By following the tips in this video, you'll be studying less and earning better grades immediately. I just wish I was studying like this sooner. Without further ado, let's get to it. First, active versus passive learning. The default studying pattern we all employ is passive learning. It's easier, requires less effort, and overall is just more comfortable. Active learning is more challenging, it's less comfortable, but it's much more effective. There are 4 steps we must address to actually use active learning. Steps 1 and 2 are about obtaining the information, and steps 3 and 4 are about reviewing and reinforcing the information. The first step is to identify what is important. Not all information is created equal. To employ active learning, you must constantly be sorting information and assessing its relative importance. Second, organize the information in a way that you understand. Again, as an active process, this isn't going to be just copying and regurgitating the information. Instead, you're going to be doing the difficult task of synthesizing the information in your own words, in diagrams, or in other study aids. For example, I loved creating tables and charts. Let's say I was comparing macrominerals like sodium, potassium, and chloride in the GI system. I would take the extra time and effort to extract the relevant information and organize it in a chart format. The process of creating this chart was enough to improve my understanding of the concepts, and now I also had an excellent study tool to review at a later date. Number 3, memorize. You need to memorize the information in an active way. I'll get to how to do that later. And lastly, apply the information. You can do practice questions from the textbook or online services. Old practice tests or practice quizzes from your professor are also fantastic resources. Next, let's move on to textbooks. I used to highlight my textbooks and read my highlights several times to review prior to exams, but that's obviously a terribly passive way to study. Reviewing your PowerPoint slides or Word documents is also equally ineffective. Instead, make the process as active as you can, even at the time of initial exposure. Using either your computer or notepad, summarize what you read into your own words. By doing this, you are identifying the important information and organizing it in a way that you will understand. This whole process will ultimately drastically improve your recall during test time. Lastly, let's cover memorization. Memorization is arguably the toughest part of studying, at least for most students. There are a few different methods you can use to memorize information much faster and much more effectively. First, summary sheets, which some people like to call condensed notes. One of the best ways to memorize is to summarize the information. Let's say you have 3 pages of notes for one lecture. Condense them into one page by organizing and restructuring the information into smaller chunks. And I don't just mean decreasing the font size, adjusting the margins. I mean actually go through and read your notes carefully and extract the highest yield points and rephrase them again into your own words. This process of condensing alone is a form of active learning, and it will reinforce the material. But now you also have this condensed study resource that you can review at a later date.
So next, I want to talk about what I actually do when I self-study. The main point here is I don't take notes. Get that out of here. I never take notes. I only make flashcards in RemNote. When I was in high school, I took this US history class where the daily homework assignment was to take handwritten notes so we can reread them to study for the exam. This took several hours every afternoon, and although it ended up with beautiful notes, they weren't very useful. And a lot of times I never even reviewed them again. Of course, I didn't know this at the time, but rereading is actually one of the least effective study strategies because it amplifies something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This happens when we believe we're much smarter than we actually are based on poor self-awareness of the situation. Basically, rereading my notes made me feel like I understood the information, but when put to the tests, I wasn't able to recall anything. Just think of the last book you read, or the last TED Talk you watched. You probably left with a feeling of awe and wonderment, and might have wanted to start a nonprofit, but if I asked you to recite the main thesis and arguments, could you? I definitely couldn't. Instead, I use a modified version of SQ3R, which Mike and I revamped to employ evidence-based practices. It stands for skim, question, rephrase, recall, and repetition. I first skim through the lecture or chapter and jot down any of the bolded terms or definitions to form an outline of what I'm going to go through. This serves as the skeleton for all of my flashcards. Then I'll go back to the beginning and start the next step, rephrase. This is also called the teach-back method or the Feynman technique. After going through a section, I'll pause, and I'll teach back the main ideas or topics at the 5th grade level. If I can explain something to a 5th grader, that means that I actually have a deep understanding of the topic. This was a really important realization for me. I used to read chapters and take notes without really knowing what I was writing down, and I'd reread them later to try to just memorize word for word. I was more focused on making these aesthetically beautiful study guides, rather than trying to understand the information. And this is a terrible approach because the main objective of learning is to understand, not to memorize. Once I had a good grasp on the material, I would then transfer that information onto my flashcards to recall. Flashcards force us to use active recall to study, one of the best learning strategies. I can't peek at the answers beforehand, unlike if I was rereading my notes where everything's just laid out. I'm not challenging myself to study. And I use RemNote to generate flashcards and organize my thinking because it also combines the next step, spaced repetition. RemNote has a built-in algorithm that spaces out your flashcards at strategic intervals, so the harder topics appear more frequently and the easier topics appear less frequently. That way you're not wasting time studying things you already know well. So after I've generated flashcards for my self-study, now I'll go back and watch the lecture, usually at 2 times speed. Since I already have a good understanding of what the lecture is going to be about, I'm just using this time to capture any ideas I might have missed and to appreciate how hard Mr. J has worked to improve his public speaking skills. Although flashcards are much less pleasant than just rereading your notes, it's this struggle that actually leads to better learning. Using more cognitive effort leads to better retention.
But now, let's jump into it. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali. I'm a final year medical student at Cambridge University, and today we're kicking off a new series where I'm going to be sharing with you evidence-based revision tips. So I'm going to be giving you advice on how you can prepare for your exams, but hopefully I'll be backing up everything I say with evidence from studies that have been done in the field of psychology on students like you and me over the last 100 years. No one ever really teaches us how to study. We tend to just go with what feels intuitively right. And as we'll see, the research has shown that actually the techniques that students think are the most intuitive often tend not to be the ones that are actually the most effective. So if you've got exams coming up, then hopefully by the end of this video, you'll pick up some techniques that you can apply to your own studies to make everything a little bit more efficient and enjoyable. So let's just jump into it. This is going to be the structure of the video. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the 3 very popular revision techniques that are shown to be less effective in the literature, namely rereading, highlighting, and making notes / summarizing. Those are by far the most popular techniques, but they're also not very effective if you look at the evidence behind them. Secondly, I'm going to be introducing the concept of active recall, which is by far the most powerful, effective study technique. And that involves like testing yourself and practicing retrieving information from your brain, because the very act of retrieving information actually strengthens connections in the brain, and there's like a load of evidence behind this. And finally, in part 3 of the video, I'll be giving you some specific tips on how you can actually apply this active recall thing to your own study. So hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have some practical strategies that you can apply if you feel like it. As always, everything is going to be and there's a really good book called Make It Stick, which I'll link down in the description below and which will pop up over here, that you can read more about these sorts of techniques if you want, and they go into more in depth about the exact evidence behind these techniques. But even then, you know, they say that the 2 most important things are active recall, which we're talking about in this video, and spaced repetition, which we'll be talking about in the next video. Hopefully I've convinced you that rereading, highlighting, and summarizing / making notes are not very effective revision strategies as judged by the evidence. Again, links in the description below if you want to read it for yourself. And hopefully I've convinced you that active recall or practice testing is a really, really useful technique, and it's far more efficient than these other techniques that students enjoy using. Now we're going to be talking about specific strategies that you can use to apply active recall or practice testing in your own studies. And the first thing to say is that this is not really rocket science. Pretty much anything you do that requires you to use cognitive effort, like use brain power to retrieve information that you have learned once already, pretty much anything is going to be really, really efficient for you. But having said that, I know a lot of you guys benefit from specific strategies, so here are 3 that I find useful personally. Number 1 is an app called Anki, and Anki is a flashcard app that you might have heard of, like loads of medical students use it. The idea behind that is that you make like an online flashcard, and then it comes up and in your like practice session. But the special thing about Anki is that once a flashcard comes up, you can mark it as being easy, medium, or hard. And depending on what rating you gave it, it comes up later on depending on what that rating was. So if you found a fact really easy to recall, maybe they'd ask you again in a day. If you found it hard to recall, they'd ask you again in 10 minutes. If you found it impossible to recall, they'd ask you again in 1 minute. And this kind of learns from your behavior, it kind of changes over time. So as you progress through your studies, as you progress through your revision, some facts that are really easy, you might see them in 2 months' time because the whole algorithm changes, and it really uses this whole spaced repetition thing to great effect. I think Anki is really good for 2 things. Firstly, I think it's really good for memorizing particular facts. So I used it a lot for anatomy back in the day, whereas like, you know, what's the nerve supply for particular muscles, things like that. And I used it a lot for pharmacology, so learning the names of drugs and what they do and what the mechanism of action is. In my 3rd year, when I was doing psychology as a subject, I also used Anki like a lot to memorize particular paragraphs to like slot into my essays. On one side of the flashcard, I would have Karpicki and Blunt 2011, and on the other side of the flashcard, I would describe the study that they did and the evidence behind it and what I was going to say about it. So therefore, in the essay, in the exam, when I wanted to recall the Karpicki and Blunt study, I would have kind of the information about it already memorized it. So I used it to memorize chunks that I could then drag and drop into my essays effectively. One of my friends, he's a Cambridge medic, he's got like first class every year. He uses Anki for pretty much everything, and he said that he can't imagine getting through Cambridge without having used Anki. And instead of making notes and lectures, what he started doing now is just going directly to making the flashcard. So yeah, if you're interested, please do check out Anki. It's free. I think you can pay a few pounds for the iOS version, but even if you don't want to pay, you can use the web version completely free of charge. I'll link it here and in the description below. Secondly, something that I like doing because I still can't quite break the habit that, you know, I enjoy making notes, is that making notes with the book closed. So not like having the textbook open and making notes and making it all pretty and copying from the textbook like I used to do, but actually like learning a topic and then closing the book and then thinking, okay, how would I explain this topic? How would I kind of make my own notes on it? So then I write down as much as I can remember about the topic in a nice fashion with like pretty colors, because that makes me feel good. And then afterwards, I open the book and see the bits that I missed. And actually, when I was preparing for my 3rd year exams, in 3rd year I did psychology, I ended up, that was by far my best performance like ever in my life on any exams. And I think the reason behind that was that because I very aggressively used these 2 techniques of spaced repetition and active recall. So what I did, I made about 50 different essay plans initially, earlier on in the year, and then in order to commit those to memory, I just drew spider diagrams with the book closed. So I would have a spider diagram for each essay plan, and I'd just draw out as much of it as I could possibly remember. And then afterwards, when I was done with it, I'd look at my actual essay plan and fill out the bits that were missing. And I repeated this over the course of like 2 months leading up to the exams. And by the end of it, by the time the exam came around, I had these 50 really, really good essays in my head that had like 10 references each, and was able to just kind of vomit them onto the paper in the actual exam. So I would fully endorse this whole making notes, making spider diagrams with the book closed as being a really effective method of active recall. And there is actually some evidence behind this. Again, it's in the book Make It Stick. It's also in Professor Danlowski's paper. You can read it down below. Finally, I want to talk about a third strategy, and that's an alternative to making notes. I know that this whole making notes thing, it's really hard to not make any notes. These days, if I'm in a lecture or if I want to learn something, instead of making notes from the lecture or from the textbook, what I instead do is that I write questions for myself. And I think this is called like the Cornell note-taking method. I came across that earlier today when researching stuff for this video. The idea is that you write questions for yourself based on the material, such that when you revise the material, you look at your questions and you try and actively answer them in your head or on paper or out loud or whatever. The point is that instead of passively rereading or highlighting the information like we are tempted to do, we have to engage in cognitive effort to retrieve this information from our brains, and that strengthens the connections between the information. It makes us more likely to remember it and to understand it. So I actually gave a talk about this evidence-based revision thing like 3 years ago when I was a third year, and a friend of mine who was a first-year medic at the time, after this talk, he had about 2 months left until the exams, and he decided that the only technique he was going to use was to just write questions for himself. So for the entire Cambridge first-year medical syllabus, he wrote himself like a list of 100 and something questions, and each night before bed he would just kind of go through them, and his revision technique was pretty much just answering these questions. And he ended up coming second in the year out of like the whole cohort. He's very intelligent in itself, but talking to him afterwards, he put a lot of faith in this method of writing questions for yourself, because writing questions for yourself makes you engage in cognitive effort, and kind of the more brain power it takes to recall a fact, the better strengthened that connection seems to get, according to the evidence at least. So yeah, instead of kind of writing notes from the textbook or from the revision guide or from the lecture notes, maybe try this method where you're writing questions for yourself, and then when you're revising the topic using hopefully spaced repetition, which we'll talk about in the next video, when you're revising the topic, then you can just answer the questions in your head. And I find this to be a really, really effective strategy for getting lots of information into your head very quickly, and hopefully you can find it useful as well. Continue watching this video and I'll explain some of the studies that have been done that convincingly show that active recall is by far a better revision strategy than pretty much anything else you can do. So let's start with this study from 1939, the start of World War II. This sort of research has been going back literally decades and decades. What they did is that they got groups of students and they made them learn a topic and then gave them a test either a week later or a day later. Now, half of these students just kind of studied the material as they normally would, and these are their results. So you can see the results are around about 50% for the high achievers and around sort of 30% for the bottom third of the group, as decided by some other outcome measure. So that was half of the group. They just studied the subject as they normally would have done, and they got a test either a day later or a week later. Now, the other half of the class studied the content in exactly the same way. However, they had a practice test at the end of it, and these are their results. So as you can see, the guys that had the practice test did far better. It's an increase of like 15% for the high achievers, an increase of like 10 to 15% for the bottom third of the class. Just having a practice test at the end of their study session improved their performance by 10 to 15%. And I don't know about you, but if I could improve my exam performance from by 10 to 15% just by, practice testing myself a bit at the end of each study session, I would certainly take that. But that's just one study. Let's talk about another study, a more recent one. This one's from 2010, and again, they split students up into two groups. One group were going to have a practice test, and the other group were just going to restudy the material using whatever method they wanted, most likely rereading, highlighting, and summarizing, which, as we've seen from other studies, are the most popular revision techniques for students. And this study was interesting because it tested students on both the facts and concepts. Here is the group that just restudied the material normally, and these are their results. So, hovering between kind of 30 and 40% because they just studied the material once and then, had a test a week later. And here is the group that studied the material, had a little practice test at the end of it, and then had the same test a week later. And these are their results. And as you can see, they're performing significantly better. For some, it's even an increase of like 30% for the first group, a difference between 30% and 60%. And again, I don't know about you, but if I could get a 30% improvement in my exam score by practicing testing myself, I would certainly take it. And I would, be doubling down on that strategy as much as I possibly could. Finally, this is one of my favorite studies. This is done from 2011, and what they did was they split students into 4 different groups. They had to learn some material and then had a test at the end, like a week later or something like that. The first group was just supposed to study the text, the chapter once. The second group was supposed to study it 4 times. The third group read the text once and then made a mind map. And the fourth group read the text once and then just tried to recall as much of the contents of the text as they possibly could. So we've got these 4 groups. Here are the results. So on verbatim questions, questions specifically from the text about factual things mentioned in the text. The group that studied it once performed the worst. As you can see, the active recall group performed significantly better than the group that restudied it 4 times. This kind of tells me that, if I just practice testing myself once, that's probably more effective than rereading this chapter 4 times. And rereading a chapter 4 times is such a common strategy that, it's pretty insane that you can get better results by just testing yourself once, or just reading it once and then just trying to recall as much of it as you can. Okay, so that was verbatim questions. Let's take these same groups of people and ask them inference questions, so questions that require you to kind of understand the text a bit more, not just retrieve isolated facts from it. And here are their results. As you can see, the group that studied it once performed the worst, as you'd expect, because they only studied it once. The active recall group performs the best, and the other groups perform all right. Again, active recall, practicing just writing down as much as they could remember from the text, improved their results significantly more than the students that have read the text 4 times. So I think this is pretty solid evidence that active recall is a really, really useful strategy. But these guys, being clever psychologists, they had a third phase of the study, and what they did was before doing any of this, they asked the students what they think the results of the study would be. So they asked the students to kind of have a guess at, which of these techniques would be the most effective. And these are the results of that. So as you can see, the students rated repeated study as being the most useful technique, and they rated active recall as being probably the least effective one. So this kind of goes to show that our own intuitive idea of what makes a good study technique does not match up with the evidence at all. We think that, reading something over and over again, of course that's going to, increase our understanding, increase our retention of it. But actually, just reading it once and then just practicing testing ourselves is just so much more efficient that it's insane that this isn't taught in schools more often. And there's a really